When I turned 65, I thought my family would finally appreciate me. Instead, I ended up being left alone in the cold. That's how I thought this would go. The dream of a family gathering, a birthday dinner, the warmth of my children and grandchildren around me. I had always hoped for something more than just the passing years, something that would make me feel truly seen. But no, that wasn't the reality. The truth was something far more painful, and in a way, it started long before my 65th birthday. It was years in the making, a slow, quiet betrayal that only came to light on that fateful evening. I'll never forget the moment when I walked into my living room. The table set perfectly, the candles lit, the smell of roast chicken filling the air, and no one was there. I waited, and I waited. My heart pounded in my chest, but I refused to believe it. They must be running late, I told myself. Surely they'd show up. I checked my phone again. Nothing. Not a word. By the time the clock hit 7 p.m., my stomach sank. They weren't coming. I couldn't even tell you how long I sat there in that empty room, staring at the untouched food, the candles burning low. It felt like a punch in the gut, but I didn't let it show. I didn't cry. I just picked up the phone and called my son, my heart racing. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. There was a long pause, and when he finally answered, his voice was casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, Mom, I forgot to tell you. We're out of town. Took a surprise trip, just the family, you know." A trip? A trip on my birthday? How could he forget to tell me about that? I felt my pulse quicken, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded, as if it didn't matter. I hung up the phone and stared at the empty seat across from me. I could hear the laughter and joy in my mind, the memories of years past when things were different. But those days were gone now. The family I once thought I knew had vanished. And in their place was a new reality, a reality where I wasn't needed, I wasn't wanted. I thought about the years I spent raising my children, giving everything to make sure they had the best life possible. And this was how they repaid me? It didn't make sense. As I stood up, I walked over to the kitchen, the noise of my footsteps and the silence filling my ears. The cake was still sitting on the counter, untouched. I'd spent hours baking it, frosting it with love and care, and now it was just another reminder of how little I meant to them. I pushed the cake into the fridge, my hands trembling as I closed the door. No one was coming. I was alone. The emptiness in my heart felt like it would swallow me whole, but I couldn't let it. I wouldn't let it. The doorbell rang. I froze, unsure if I wanted to answer it. Maybe it was them. Maybe they'd realized their mistake. But when I opened the door, it wasn't them. It was just the delivery guy, dropping off a bouquet of flowers. "For you, Mrs. Adams," he said, handing me the card. I stared at the card for a moment before taking it. My hands felt numb as I read the note. "Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you're doing well. Love, Ethan and family." Ethan and family. No mention of the dinner. No mention of the plans I'd carefully laid out. Just a card, a small gesture, that felt like a slap in the face. I thanked the delivery guy and closed the door. The flowers were beautiful, but they felt like a cruel reminder of the family I no longer had. They didn't care. They never did. I couldn't stop thinking about how long it had been since we'd all been together, how much I had sacrificed for them over the years. But what did it mean? I had given everything, and they had taken it all without a second thought. The emptiness inside me grew with each passing minute. As I sat back down at the table, I felt something cold inside me snap. I wasn't going to let this happen again. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I didn't know how, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being invisible. I was done being the person everyone took for granted. And I was going to make them regret it. I don't know how I'll make things right, but I'm going to start. I'm going to fight for my place in this world, even if I have to do it alone. I spent the next few days and a daze, replaying the events over and over in my mind, unable to shake the image of my family enjoying their surprise trip without me. The loneliness felt suffocating, and yet there was something else too, a strange, burning anger that I hadn't realized was bubbling beneath the surface. I had spent my entire life giving, caring, and providing for them, and this was how they repaid me? A phone call with no apology, a quick text to acknowledge my birthday, and a card with no meaning. I thought about all those years I had spent sacrificing for my children. I gave up so much, my own dreams, my freedom, my own happiness, for them. And this was the thanks I got. It wasn't just a missed birthday dinner. It wasn't just a few days of silence. It was a pattern, a deep-rooted disregard for everything I had done for them. I had been pushed to the sidelines for years, and this birthday was just the final straw. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the dark sky, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. I had spent so many years trying to hold everything together, keeping up the facade that everything was fine, that I was fine. But I wasn't. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I needed to take control of my life, to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I had spent so long being the one who gave, and now it was time for me to take. I thought about the house, the one that had been my sanctuary, the place where my children grew up, the place where I had spent countless hours making it a home, making their lives easier, trying to create memories that would last forever. But now, it felt like a prison. The walls that had once been filled with laughter and love now felt suffocating. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed a fresh start. I needed to leave behind everything that had reminded me of the years I wasted, the years I spent feeling invisible. I took a deep breath and stood up from the chair. It was time to make a decision. I didn't know what that decision was going to be yet, but I knew it had to be something big, something that would show them that I wasn't going to be their doormat anymore. I wasn't going to be the one who was always overlooked, always dismissed. I had given everything for them, but I had nothing left to give. I needed to take care of myself for once, and that meant making some hard choices. The next morning, I called a real estate agent. I wasn't sure what kind of place I was looking for, but I knew it had to be far from here. I couldn't stay in this town, not with all the memories that haunted me. I needed to be somewhere new, somewhere that didn't remind me of how I had been treated. The agent told me she had a few places in mind, and I agreed to meet her later that afternoon. As I sat in the waiting room, I felt a strange sense of hope beginning to grow inside me. Maybe this was the change I needed. Maybe I could start fresh. Maybe I could find a place where I wasn't just the woman who had been taken for granted. When the agent arrived, we went through the listings, and she showed me a few options. But it wasn't until we arrived at a small cottage on the outskirts of town that I knew I had found the place. It was quiet, peaceful, and far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It had a little garden in the front and a porch where I could sit and drink my coffee in the mornings. It was the perfect place to escape, to finally have some peace. I made an offer on the spot, and within a week, everything was finalized. The house sold quickly, and just like that, I was free. Free from the family who had never truly seen me. Free from the life I had built for them. It wasn't easy to leave, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I packed up my things, left behind the memories, and drove away. As I pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The future was waiting for me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. I spent the next few weeks in a fog, my days blending into one another as I adjusted to my new life. The house was quiet, the silence almost deafening at times. I spent my mornings sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, and watching the world go by. It was peaceful, yes, but it also felt empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, like a part of me had been left behind when I walked out of the old house. I had hoped that this new beginning would bring clarity, but instead, it only left me with more questions. Why had it taken me so long to make the decision to leave? Was I really running away, or was I simply choosing to start over? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that leaving wasn't just about escaping the past. It was about taking control of my own future, something I had never really done before. For so many years, I had put everyone else's needs before my own, always sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of the family. But now, I was finally doing something for myself, something that I had always wanted but never had the courage to pursue. But the guilt still lingered. I had left my children behind, and that weighed heavily on me. I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. They were my flesh and blood, and yet, they had treated me like I was invisible. I thought about my son, how distant he had become over the years, how he and his family had shut me out without ever looking back. I couldn't help but feel a pang of regret every time I thought about him. But then I remembered what had happened on my birthday. The neglect, the absence, the emptiness. It wasn't just that they had forgotten me. It was that they had never truly seen me. I was just a convenience to them, something they could take for granted. They didn't need me, and maybe that was the hardest truth to swallow. I had been a mother, a wife, a caregiver for so long that I had forgotten who I was outside of those roles. And now, standing alone in my new home, I was faced with the reality that I was no longer defined by my family. It was liberating in a way, but it was also terrifying. Who was I, really? What was left for me if not the familiar roles of wife and mother? The house felt like a blank slate, waiting for me to fill it with something new. But what? What did I want now that I had no one to care for but myself? I spent hours walking around the house, rearranging things, trying to find a place for my things. The furniture felt foreign, the walls empty. It wasn't home yet, not in the way the old house had been. But I didn't need it to be. I didn't need the past to follow me anymore. I was going to create something new, something that was just mine. But the loneliness crept in again, a sharp reminder that I was still adjusting, still figuring out who I was in this new life. I started to make plans for the future, things I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I signed up for a painting class, something I had always dreamed of but never had the chance to pursue. I took long walks in the nearby park, breathing in the fresh air and letting the calm of nature soothe my restless mind. Slowly, I began to feel a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that I hadn't felt in years. But the past was never far behind. It haunted me in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts. I couldn't erase the memories of my family, the years I had spent giving everything to them. I couldn't forget the way they had turned their backs on me, but I had to let go. I had to move forward. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, I felt stronger. And as I stood in front of the canvas, brush in hand, I realized that this was my chance to create something beautiful out of the mess that had been my life. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Maybe this new chapter wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it. I was ready to finally live for myself. The weeks started to blur together as I settled into my new life. The initial excitement of leaving everything behind began to fade, replaced by a quiet unease. I had thought that starting fresh would bring me a sense of freedom, but it wasn't as simple as I imagined. The house was still foreign to me, despite the new coat of paint, the carefully chosen furniture, and the little touches I added to make it my own. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe and live for myself. But something was missing. I wasn't sure what it was, but the emptiness lingered. There were moments when I thought about my children, my son, especially. I couldn't deny the love I still felt for them, even after everything that had happened. But the pain, the betrayal, was hard to ignore. How could they have done this to me? How could they have abandoned me so easily? I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. I couldn't dwell on the past any longer. It was time to move forward. Slowly, I began to find small joys in the simple things. I started to cook again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I found peace in the rhythm of chopping vegetables, stirring the pot, the familiar scent of herbs and spices filling the air. It reminded me of the times when I used to cook for my family, when it felt like the kitchen was the heart of the home. Those moments, though fleeting, brought a small sense of comfort. I also started to take longer walks, exploring the neighborhood. There was a park nearby, a quiet place where I could sit and watch the world go by. I found solace in the stillness, in the way the trees swayed gently in the breeze, in the chirping of birds overhead. The world seemed so much smaller here, and in a way, that made it feel safer. But despite the tranquility, my mind kept drifting back to my family. I couldn't help but wonder if they had even noticed I was gone. My son had barely called since I left. And when he did, the conversation was always brief, distant. I could feel the walls between us growing taller with every word. I knew he wasn't happy with my decision to leave, but he had never understood how I felt. How could he? He had never truly seen me, not for who. I was outside of being his mother. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was ready to face it, whatever it might be. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally in control of my own life. It had been a few weeks since I moved into the new house, and I was still getting used to the silence that filled the space. It was strange, but there was a certain peace in it, a calm I hadn't known in years. My mornings were spent on the porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the sun rise over the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my life. But even in the stillness, the thoughts of my children, particularly my son, continued to linger. I couldn't help but wonder how they were doing, what they were thinking. Had they even noticed my absence? The guilt I had carried for years started to fade, but it was replaced by something else, a quiet longing. I had always been the one who kept the family together, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. But now, I was on my own, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. The first time I saw my son after moving out, it was almost as if nothing had changed. He called me one afternoon, his voice the same as always. "Mom, how's the new place?" he asked, but there was no real interest in his tone. It was just a casual question, one of those things people say out of habit. I could hear his wife in the background, her voice faint but unmistakable. It was clear they were busy, and I didn't want to be a bother. "It's fine," I replied, trying to sound upbeat, trying to hide the emptiness I felt. "Just getting settled in." There was a pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again. "Good. You're doing all right." I could hear the uncertainty in his voice now, but I didn't know how to respond. How could I tell him that I was still struggling to find my place in a world that had turned its back on me? How could I explain that I was no longer just the woman who took care of everything, but someone who had to take care of herself for the first time in years? "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "I'm all right." "All right. Well, I'll let you go then. Take care of yourself, okay?" And with that, the conversation ended. Just like that. No apology, no mention of the past, just a quick and impersonal goodbye. It was like he had moved on without me, as if I was nothing more than a fleeting thought in his busy life. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I couldn't help but think about the years I had spent raising him, giving him everything I had, only to be pushed aside when I needed them the most. I had always believed that family was supposed to be there for each other, but it felt like that was only true when it was convenient for them. I thought about my own mother, how she had always been there for me, no matter what. And now, I was left to fend for myself. The realization hit me hard, but it also made me feel something else, freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. I didn't have to keep pretending, didn't have to be the one who always put everyone else first. I could focus on myself, on what made me happy, and that thought gave me a sense of power I hadn't known in a long time. I decided that I wasn't going to let them dictate my happiness anymore. I wasn't going to let their neglect define who I was. I started to fill my days with things I enjoyed. I went to the local library and picked up books I had always wanted to read, but never had the time for. I took up gardening, something I had always dreamed of doing, and spent hours planting flowers and vegetables in my small garden. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Slowly, I began to feel like I was finding myself again. And as the days passed, the emptiness I had felt began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. But even in this new chapter of my life, I couldn't forget about my son. I couldn't ignore the pain of being left behind, of being cast aside like I was nothing. It wasn't something I could easily let go of, but I knew that I had to try. I had to let go of the bitterness, the resentment, and move forward. It wasn't easy, but I was learning that life didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. Maybe I wasn't the person I used to be, but that didn't mean I couldn't create a new version of myself. I wasn't just a mother or a wife anymore. I was someone who deserved to be happy, who deserved to be seen, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally starting to see myself. The future was uncertain, but I was ready to face it on my own terms. As the weeks went by, I settled into a routine in my new home, but the feeling of being uprooted lingered. The quiet that once felt like freedom now seemed heavy, as if the weight of years of living for others had finally caught up with me. I was no longer just a mother or a wife. I was someone who had to learn how to live for herself. It wasn't easy. I still felt the echoes of my old life, the sounds of family dinners, the laughter of grandchildren, the constant rush of life that I had always kept up with. Those memories haunted me, not because I wanted them back, but because I realized how much of my own life had been spent in service of others. I had always been the one to make things work, to keep everyone together, to be the one people turned to when things went wrong. But now I was alone. No one was asking me to fix anything. No one needed me. And for the first time, I didn't know how to deal with that. I went to the grocery store one afternoon just to get out of the house. It had been a while since I'd done something as simple as shopping for myself. I walked down the aisles, picking up items I needed, but also a few things I didn't. I wasn't really hungry for them, but I found comfort in the act of filling my cart. It was like I was trying to fill the emptiness that had taken root inside me. As I reached the checkout line, I ran into an old friend from my neighborhood, Martha. She was surprised to see me, and her face lit up with recognition. "Well, if it isn't Lena." she said, her voice cheerful, as if nothing had changed. How have you been? I smiled back at her, but I could feel the weight of the past few months pressing down on me. I've been good, I replied, my voice steady but hollow. Just adjusting to the new place. Martha didn't miss a beat. I heard you moved. That's great, Lena. You always needed a change, you know? How's the new house treating you? I nodded, but there was something in the way she said it that made me feel like she didn't really understand. Maybe no one did. It's nice, I said, forcing a smile. Peaceful. She smiled back, but there was something in her eyes that made me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't sympathy, it was something else. Well, you know, she said, her voice lowering just a little. I've been meaning to ask. How's your son taking it? I froze for a moment. The question caught me off guard, and for a second, I didn't know how to answer. Martha wasn't the type to pry, but there was an underlying curiosity in her tone. He's fine, I said quickly, not wanting to open up. He's just busy, you know how it is. But Martha wasn't done. And the rest of the family? They're all good. I forced a smile. Everyone's fine. They've all got their own lives. She nodded, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I'm sure it's hard, Lena, she said softly. I know you've always been so devoted to them. The words stung more than I expected. She didn't mean to hurt me, but they hit a nerve. It was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it, but I had spent so many years putting everyone else first that I didn't know how to live for myself. I wasn't even sure who I was without them. It's fine, I said, my voice steadier now. I'm fine. But I wasn't. I wasn't fine at all. As I left the store, I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the ache of a mother who had given everything, only to be left behind. The ache of someone who had spent her whole life caring for others, but had never learned how to care for herself. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but the thoughts wouldn't go away. They kept coming back, over and over. How could they not see what they had done? How could they not realize that I was a person too, not just a mother or a wife? I had spent my whole life being everything for everyone, and now I was nothing. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, an apology, a change, a sign that things would be different, but it never came. I began to realize that maybe it wasn't going to come. Maybe I was never going to get the closure I thought I deserved. But one thing was clear. I had to stop waiting for them to see me. I had to start seeing myself. It was hard, so hard, but I knew that if I kept looking to them for validation, I would always be disappointed. I couldn't keep living in the shadows of my past. I had to find a way to move forward on my own terms. I didn't know what that looked like yet, but for the first time, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew it had to be better than this. And so, I made a promise to myself that day. I would stop waiting for someone else to change. I would stop waiting for someone else to make things right. I would change. I would take control of my life, and I would stop letting the past define me. It was time to finally start living for myself. The days seemed to pass by in a blur, the weight of my decision still heavy on my chest. I had moved forward, yes, but it felt like I was still looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to shift. The loneliness was different now. It was no longer a suffocating presence, but a quiet companion, one I was learning to live with. I spent more time outside, walking through the park, taking in the fresh air, letting the world move around me while I stood still. There was something calming about it, the way the trees swayed in the wind, the soft murmur of distant conversations, the simple sound of footsteps on the path. I began to embrace the stillness. My neighbors had begun to notice my presence, which, at first, had been an intrusion. I wasn't used to people paying attention to me, to showing an interest in my life. But slowly, I started to make connections, small ones. A wave here, a hello there. I even had a few short conversations with the woman down the street, Sarah, who seemed genuinely interested in how I was settling in. It was strange at first, this idea of being seen by someone other than my family. But it felt good, in a way I couldn't fully explain. There were no expectations, no history to weigh us down. Just two people meeting in the present. Sarah invited me to a small gathering at her house one Saturday evening. I almost declined, the thought of socializing with strangers unnerving me. But something in her smile, the warmth in her voice, made me reconsider. I hadn't been out with people in so long, and I realized I missed it, the feeling of being part of something. So I accepted. That evening, I put on a simple dress, something that had been buried in the back of my closet for years, and I drove to Sarah's house. As I stepped out of the car, I felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach. It wasn't just the unfamiliar faces that made me uneasy. It was the thought of being judged. But I reminded myself that this was a new beginning, and I was no longer the person I had been. I walked up the driveway and knocked on the door. Sarah opened it with a bright smile, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Lena, I'm so glad you could make it," she said warmly. I smiled back, though I could feel the butterflies in my chest. "Thank you for inviting me." She ushered me inside, where a few other neighbors had gathered. The evening was filled with light conversation, the clink of glasses, the hum of laughter. I found myself joining in, adding my voice to the mix, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged. I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't invisible. Not here, not anymore. People saw me, they listened, and I was starting to realize that I didn't need my family's approval to feel validated. I could build my own world, one small step at a time. As the night wore on, I felt more relaxed, more myself. The weight of the past seemed lighter, and I was finally starting to feel the joy of living for myself. But even as I laughed with the others, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder about my family. They had barely crossed my mind in those hours of conversation and laughter, but as I drove home that night, the emptiness crept back in. I thought about my son, my grandchildren, and what I had left behind. I thought about how they were living their lives without me, how they had moved on so easily. The loneliness returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't a crushing, suffocating force. It was a quiet reminder. I had made the right choice. I had chosen myself, and that was enough. I didn't need them to understand, to validate my decision. I had built my own path, and I was learning to walk it with my head held high. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always clear, but I knew now that I was capable of more than I had ever believed. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, because I knew I could handle it. I was learning to live for myself, and that was the greatest gift I could give to me. The weeks that followed felt like a delicate balance between the new life I was trying to build and the remnants of the old one I could never quite shake off. I was still adjusting, still trying to figure out what it meant to live for myself, but things were starting to fall into place, little by little. The loneliness was no longer suffocating. Instead, it became something I could sit with, something I could bear. I began spending more time in the garden, tending to the flowers I'd planted, watching them slowly bloom as the seasons shifted. There was something calming about it, the way the earth responded to care and attention. It felt like the act of nurturing something, even something as small as a flower, was a reflection of what I needed to do for myself. I was learning, slowly but surely, how to nurture my own soul. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the thoughts of my family would creep back in, uninvited, and the ache of abandonment would settle. In my chest, I wondered what my son was doing, if he missed me at all. I thought about my grandchildren, their faces I hadn't seen in so long, and whether they would ever understand why I left. The anger I had felt when I first left was fading, but the hurt remained. There were moments when I would catch myself remembering something, a small detail about my life with them, and the feeling would hit me all over again. But with each passing day, it became easier to sit with those feelings and let them pass. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't force them to see me, to understand the pain I had endured. What I could do was change how I responded to it. I could choose to stop holding on to the past. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, a letter arrived. It wasn't something I had been expecting, and as I held it in my hands, I felt a sense of hesitation. My heart beat a little faster, and I knew, deep down, that it was from my son. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling ever so slightly. The letter was brief, just a few lines written in his familiar handwriting. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot lately. I realize now that I haven't been the best son. I've taken you for granted, and for that, I'm sorry. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you left, but I want you to know that I miss you. I hope we can find a way to rebuild what we lost." I read the words over and over, the weight of them settling in my chest. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, to tell him everything I had been holding inside. But another part of me knew that there was no quick fix to the years of hurt, no easy way to undo the damage that had been done. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath. It felt like a turning point, but I wasn't sure what the next step should be. My son had reached out, and that in itself was a significant step forward. But what did that mean for me? What did it mean for the future of our relationship? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that I had a choice to make. I could choose to hold on to the past, to keep dwelling on everything that went wrong, or I could choose to move forward. I could choose to forgive, not for them, but for myself. I could choose to heal. As the days went on, I thought more about what I wanted for the future. I had spent so many years living for others, and now it was time to live for me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was ready to face it. The anger, the resentment, it all started to feel less important. What mattered was my own happiness, my own sense of peace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was beginning to find it. I began to reconnect with parts of myself I had long neglected, the things that had brought me joy before everything changed. I started painting again, a hobby I had set aside years ago. I picked up books I had never had time to read and started writing in a journal, reflecting on my thoughts, my hopes, and my dreams. I wasn't waiting for someone else to fix things anymore. I was doing it for myself. But even with all the progress I was making, there were moments when doubt crept in. Could I really let go of the past? Could I truly forgive and move forward? I didn't have the answers, but I knew that I had to try. I had to believe that I deserved more than the life I had lived before. I had to believe that I could have the peace and happiness I had always dreamed of. So, as I sat in the garden that afternoon, I made a promise to myself. I would stop waiting for someone else to change. I would stop waiting for validation from anyone else. I would start living the life I deserved, no matter what. The future was uncertain, but I was finally ready to face it on my own terms. The weeks continued to pass, and the weight of the decisions I had made began to settle into a quiet, steady rhythm. My days were no longer filled with the chaos of family obligations and expectations, but with the simple, peaceful routine of living for myself. I found comfort in the small things, sipping coffee on the porch in the morning, tending to my garden, reading a book in the afternoons. It was a life I had always dreamed of, but never allowed myself to have. But even in this newfound peace, the questions lingered. What would the future hold? Would my family ever truly understand my decision to leave? Would they ever come to realize the depth of the pain I had endured, or was that something I would have to carry alone? I thought about the letter from my son, how it had made my heart ache with a mixture of longing and hope. It was a step, yes, but it was only a small one. Could I trust that things could truly change between us? Or was this just another attempt to smooth things over without addressing the deeper issues? I wasn't sure. I had spent years hoping, waiting, trying to fix things that weren't mine to fix. But now, I had learned that the only person I could truly change was myself. I didn't need them to validate me. I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. I had spent so long searching for love and acceptance from the wrong places. Now, I was finally learning to give that love to myself. The truth was, I didn't know what would happen with my family. I didn't know if they would ever truly see me, if they would ever understand the sacrifices I had made, the years I had spent giving everything without receiving anything in return. But I realized that I couldn't keep waiting for that moment. I couldn't keep holding my breath, hoping they would finally come to their senses. It was time to stop looking back. I had to keep moving forward, no matter what. And so, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for anyone else to change. I wasn't going to wait for them to come around, to finally realize what they had lost. I was going to keep building the life I deserved, one day at a time. I wasn't going to let the past hold me back any longer. I had worked hard to get to this place, to find my peace, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that away from me. I started to think about the future with a new sense of purpose. Maybe I could travel, see the places I had always wanted to visit. Maybe I could take up new hobbies, meet new people, experience life in ways I had never allowed myself to before. The possibilities felt endless. I didn't need permission from anyone to live my life. For the first time in years, I was beginning to feel like I was truly free. The healing process wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had made the right choice, moments when I missed my family. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. The longer I lived for myself, the more I realized that I was capable of so much more than I had ever imagined. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living, and that was enough. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't the same peace I had sought from others for so many years. It wasn't the peace that came from approval or validation. It was a deeper, more lasting peace. It was the peace that comes from knowing that you are enough, just as you are. As the days passed, I continued to move forward, knowing that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, but I was ready for them. I had already faced the hardest part, learning to live for myself, and nothing could take that away. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I didn't know where the path would lead, but I knew I was strong enough to walk it. And that, in itself, was the greatest gift I could give myself.